The long period of waiting for the people of Europe has ended. The era of tension, fear, and anxiety is over. Time moved swiftly in the recent years, and the continent has gone through waves of emotions. In 1938, Britain feared war, distributing gas masks and calling up reserves, while Hitler pushed the continent to the brink of conflict. He demanded the incorporation of the German minority in Czechoslovakia, the Sudeten Germans, into Greater Germany. Democracies, Britain and France, met with dictatorships in Munich in the first modern summit conference, resulting in a settlement imposed on the Czechoslovak state that granted Hitler all his desires. The people of Europe rejoiced at the news, believing that a new system had been agreed upon to ensure permanent peace, with the great powers committing to negotiations instead of war. The continent thought that Hitler had no more demands, and the Sudeten territories were joined to the Reich. However, these illusions of success were shattered within months. The rest of Czechoslovakia was divided into several parts and partitioned among neighboring countries according to German designs. Now, the Nazis shifted their ambitions toward Poland, demanding the return of German lands given to Poland after World War I. These demands concealed German expansionist ambitions toward the east, fueled by the Nazi ideology's insatiable thirst for land. There was no room for compromise or appeasement as the Nazis began encroaching on Slovak lands. Unlike the Czechs, the Poles refused to yield to Hitler's demands. Britain joined France in an alliance with Poland, forming the final link in the road to war. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin then sealed the deal, aligning himself with Hitler. This pact gave Hitler a free hand to destroy Poland, while the communists were rewarded with half of Poland, pushing their borders westward. Within a few weeks, the Polish state was torn apart. Parts of it were annexed into the German Reich, while other sections were placed under Nazi or Soviet occupation. The Allies stood powerless as the country they had pledged to aid was overrun. Modern mechanized armies of tanks swept over Polish infantry and cavalry, and then nothing. After weeks of fierce fighting, calm returned to the continent. The period following the destruction of Poland, which took just 5 weeks, was tense and was referred to as the Phony War. This term was coined in the United States, while the British spoke of the Boer War or the Twilight War. The French called it the Drôle de Guerre, and in Germany, it was known as the Sitzkrieg. France and Britain, the two democracies, reaffirmed their decision to abandon appeasement and honor their commitment to Poland. However, they did little to offer any material assistance that might have indirectly helped the Poles by diverting Hitler's attention. French commander Gamelin's view of the war was defensive, centered on protecting France and repelling any German aggression. This mentality prevailed within the French military ranks. There were no attempts by the French heavy artillery to shell German industrial areas within range. Small skirmishes occurred inside Germany, and when French forces reached the Siegfried Line, a series of German fortifications parallel to the Maginot Line, they stopped. This inertia and passive waiting demoralized the French army, especially the thousands of reserve soldiers who had been called up from civilian life. Britain also hesitated in confronting Hitler. Britain, in particular, feared air raids and rejected suggestions from the Royal Air Force to burn down the Black Forest in Germany. Proposals to bomb German weapons factories were dismissed as attacks on private property. There was a suggestion by Churchill to mine German rivers, key arteries for the Reich's economy. But both the British and French feared retaliation. The first British soldier was not killed until December 1939, in stark contrast to World War I, where 50,000 soldiers had already died by that point. No wonder the war felt phony. The resolve and determination that had swept over the democratic nations when the war broke out began to fade gradually. The desire to resist a sudden anticipated attack turned into boredom. Blackouts, food rationing, the evacuation of children from their homes, and the closure of entertainment venues all became nuisances. Numerous emergency laws enacted in the early months of the war imposed restrictions and interventions in people's daily lives, rendering them ineffective or pointless. It was not just the Allies' inaction that contributed to the phony war. The Germans, too, were in no hurry to escalate the conflict. They wanted to consolidate their hold over the territories they had occupied in Poland. Some German generals believed that the army was not yet ready for war and, like the French and British, hoped for the war to fade away and for a peaceful settlement to be reached. If neither side provoked the other, perhaps the conflict would dissolve. Another factor contributing to the phony war might have been the fact that the winter that year was particularly harsh. The war seemed real only over the oceans. Germany's naval strategy focused on attacking enemy ships through aerial raids and U-boats. In the final weeks of peacetime, large numbers of German ships left their ports and vanished into the vast ocean. The U-boat fleet took up positions in the Atlantic, and with the outbreak of war, they launched swift attacks on merchant ships and engaged in skirmishes with naval forces. A long-standing issue of anticipation for the people of Europe has come to an end. The era of pressure, fear, and anxiety has concluded. Time has moved swiftly in recent years, and the city has experienced one transition after another. In 1938, Britain was fearful of war and took steps such as aerial precautions and issuing warnings to preserve order, while Hitler was pushing the city down the path of opposition. He demanded to annex the Sudetenland, incorporating it into a larger German empire. Democracies like Britain and France sanctioned agreements at the Munich Conference in the first year of the League of Nations, facilitating the annexation of the Sudetenland into Czechoslovakia, allowing Hitler to achieve all of his objectives. People in Europe saw themselves at a crossroads, believing a new system had been established to ensure lasting peace, with the great powers relying on diplomacy rather than war. The public thought Hitler had no further ambitions, and that the Sudetenland had been incorporated peacefully. However, this illusion of peace was shattered within months. The remaining northern part of Czechoslovakia was divided and distributed among neighboring countries, as Germany's power continued to grow. Now, the objectives shifted towards Poland, with demands to reclaim the German territories that had been ceded to Poland after the First World War. These claims ignited tensions over the central German regions, further pushing towards aggressive expansion. There was no aid or intervention when the Nazis began encroaching on Polish territory. Unlike the case of the Sudetenland, Poland was not willing to concede to Hitler's demands. Britain and France entered into an agreement with Poland, forming the final alliance on the path to war. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin then came into the negotiation process, aligning himself with Hitler. This granted Hitler free rein to destroy Poland while the Soviets preserved part of Poland, shifting their influence westward. Within a matter of weeks, Poland was divided. A portion was annexed by the German Reich, marking the collapse of the Polish state.
Britain and its empire faced their darkest hour during the war, as Nazi forces stood on the brink of victory in the summer of 1940. After months of a so-called phony war, it turned into a brutal and tragic conflict. Following a disastrous campaign in Norway, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, architect of the 1930s appeasement policy that sacrificed Czechoslovakia at the Munich Conference, lost the trust of the British people in Parliament. He was replaced in dramatic fashion by Winston Churchill. Churchill, upon taking office, offered the British people nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The spring and early summer of 1940 brought Britain bad news and a string of defeats for its armed forces and allies. The European continent fell rapidly to the blitzkrieg tactics of the Nazi armored forces. The Netherlands, Belgium, and France all surrendered within weeks. The French were humiliated as German forces marched under the Arc de Triomphe. The British army was trapped in France with nothing but the sea behind it. In a moment of fortune, Hitler's indecision allowed over 250,000 British and French soldiers to be evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk by an armada of ships and small boats. Meanwhile, in Britain, the nation braced for an expected Nazi invasion. The southern coastline turned into a fortified camp. Home guards, made up of older men and young boys, were quickly enlisted and armed with makeshift weapons. They, along with the British population, anxiously awaited the church bells, which would signal the beginning of the invasion. A sense of fear, rumors, and paranoia spread across Britain. Spies and infiltrators were reportedly seen everywhere. In the wider world, it seemed as though Britain was isolated. The Soviet Union extinguished the independence of the Baltic states, granted to them by Hitler, who gave the Soviets free rein in the east. Fascist Italy entered the war, forging the Rome-Berlin axis into a military and political alliance. Meanwhile, the United States remained neutral. Churchill warned Britain's enemies that they would be fought on the beaches and that Britain would never surrender. By the height of summer in 1940, the battle for Britain's survival and for the freedom of Europe was unfolding not on the beaches, but in the clear blue skies of southern Britain. The story of the Battle of Britain is not just one of weapons, but also of technology. It is a tale of national bravery and individual courage, echoing a timeless story in human conflict. The necessity of survival and the need to defend against enemies have always driven technological advancements, particularly in the creation of more powerful and destructive weapons. However, as always, those new weapons were met by even stronger ones, more advanced defenses and superior tactics. To understand the Battle of Britain, we need to look back before the war, to when military thinkers around the world were theorizing about future conflicts. At the dawn of the 20th century, it was hard to grasp that the invention of flight still existed within living memory, with the Wright brothers' first flight occurring in 1903. By the time of World War I in 1914, airplanes, once a breathtaking wonder of science, had rapidly evolved into war machines. Initially used for reconnaissance, by 1918, aircraft technology had leaped forward, producing specialized warplanes, bombers, and fighters. The First World War saw the birth of strategic bombing, targeting civilians and industrial centers. Ordinary people, far from the battlefields, experienced the terror of aerial attacks for the first time. By the war's end, British bombers had the capability to cross the Atlantic. Military theorists believed that airplanes were a decisive weapon that could change warfare forever. They envisioned air power as a way to avoid the horrors of trench warfare, and some politicians even believed that air power could win wars without the need for large armies. During the interwar years, it was widely believed that any future war would be short and dominated by air battles. The victor would be the side with air superiority. The threat of overwhelming bombers could, in theory, compel surrender without the need to bomb cities or industrial centers, or force enemy populations to evacuate. There was even fear that chemical weapons might be used. Based on these beliefs, no sane government wanted to risk such destruction. The wars of the future, it was thought, would be clean, short, and result in fewer casualties and less destruction. Experiences during the Spanish Civil War validated the theory that bombers would always get through. German bombers supporting Franco's forces brought rapid destruction to Spanish cities. The destruction of Guernica in the Basque region sent a chilling message to the world about the power of air warfare. The British Royal Air Force, RAF, also used bombers ruthlessly to maintain control over parts of the British Empire without risking British lives, bombing rebellious villages in Arab lands and Afghanistan, avoiding the need to send in soldiers. Italy's Air Force used similar tactics, including poison gas, to subdue the forces of Emperor Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. However, the easy victories were an illusion. The Spanish Republican government lacked an air force or air defenses, and Guernica had no protection. The tribal populations terrorized by the RAF had no anti-aircraft defenses, no shelters, and no fighters. Even in Ethiopia, a society that had not yet advanced beyond the medieval era, the Italian Air Force was met with little opposition. Yet World War II and the Battle of Britain demonstrated that air power was not invincible. German air forces decimated soldiers across Europe, from Poland to France, but success was not a validation of air power theories. Supporting ground forces is one thing. Winning a war solely with air power is another. The German blitzkrieg across Europe was a new type of warfare that combined tanks, planes, and infantry to defeat enemy armies. However, in the Battle of Britain, the Air Force was on its own, fighting a war where Air Force met Air Force, free from the constraints of supporting ground or naval operations. To fully understand the Battle of Britain, we must remember that this was an air battle fought on British soil, with German planes having only limited time for combat before needing to refuel and rearm. German pilots who were shot down were lost forever, while British pilots who survived could fight again. Despite their strengths, both air forces had weaknesses that could tip the balance in favor of either side. This translation keeps the original meaning and flow of the article while using fluent, polished American English. If you have any preferences or need further revisions, feel free to let me know.